Welcome, everyone. Welcome to our webinar today. I wish to welcome you all on behalf of the Bioethics Interest Group at the George Washington University and the Office of Research Excellence at the Milken Institute School of Public Health. Welcome to our webinar today that is focusing on diversity plans for improving enrollment of underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials. These webinars are held in collaboration with our research ethics capacity strengthening programs in Mali, Zimbabwe, and also in Pakistan. So a big welcome. I can see we have colleagues that are joining us from different parts of the world and also from within GW. Let me also take this opportunity to welcome our panelists. So usually we have 2 panelists, but today we have 3 panelists. So thanks to our 3 panelists for joining us today. Our first panelist is Dr. Bridget Rice, who is an Associate Dean for Research and Innovation, and also the Richard and Marianne Crader Endowed Professor in Nursing for Vulnerable Populations at the Louis Fitzpatrick College of Nursing at Villanova University. And our second panelist is Dr. Daniel Mullins, who is a professor and executive director for the Patients Program at the University of Maryland School of Pharmacy. And our third panelist is Dr. Melvin Eccles, who is the Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer at the American College of Cardiology. He is also an Associate Professor of Medicine and Associate Director at the Cardiovascular Research Institute at the Morehouse School of Medicine. Welcome to our 3 panelists. And my name is Paul Debele. I'm an Assistant Director in the Office of Research Excellence. I also teach various courses through the Department of Global Health here at the Milken Institute School of Public Health. We are also joined by my colleague and co-moderator, Dr. Melissa Goldstein, who is a professor in health policy and management within our School of Public Health. So welcome, everyone. So I will now just go through our agenda. So we are going to shortly have presentations by our panelists, of course, starting with Dr. Rice, and then Dr. Mullins, and then Dr. Eccles. And then we are going to go through a moderated question and answer segment. And my apologies, there is a fire alarm which is ringing here. I know there's someone who is frying things upstairs. So I will not panic. And then after that, we'll then go through some closing remarks by our panelists. And let me encourage all of the participants today that you can share with us your questions and also comments through the chat box. At the end of it all, I will have the chance to go through some of those questions. And thanks to a lot of the participants today who sent in some questions in advance. So we're going to use some of those once our panelists are done with their short presentations. So without much ado, I would like to now introduce Dr. Rice to share with us.
Hello, everyone, and thank you so much, Dr. Ndebe. I'm really excited for this conversation and to answer questions as we get into that portion of the presentation. And so I want to talk to us this morning, afternoon, evening, depending on where you are, about addressing the underrepresentation of racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials. We know that these trials play a crucial role in advancing research as well as improving healthcare, but we have this pressing need to make sure that we have representation in these studies as they're being done. And so through the presentation, I'll highlight the importance of doing this work, but then also put forward some strategies that we can do to improve enrollment. If we think about what the problem is, just looking at US-based trials alone, and we see that it's amplified in international contexts, out of almost 21,000 trials, less than half, so only 43%, reported any race or ethnicity data. So that means we're missing information on large segments of the population, and we don't know if the advancements, right, that are being discovered are going to apply to those groups. When we then look at trialee or the trial enrollee distribution, we see that those who are enrolled aren't mirroring the US population that they represent. And so if we look at white individuals, we see 111% overrepresentation, where they represent 72% of the population, but then 80% for the median of individuals that are enrolled in clinical trials. Where this is even more amplified, if you'll notice, there are differences between the different racial and ethnic groups, but among Hispanic and Latino populations, we see the greatest percentage of underrepresentation at 38%. So when we're looking at diversity in clinical trials, why does this matter, right? Why is this a problem? Well, we know that trials are going to be essential to ensure that interventions are safe, that what we are proposing to do is effective, right? And that it applies to different populations. So when there's actually underrepresentation in trials, we have racial and ethnic populations where those contributions that we could have, where we would have these advancements, where we would learn more, where we would apply different information, we're now actually contributing to healthcare inequities by not having these populations part of trials. And ultimately, that's going to hinder the development of personalized treatments. On the other hand, if we have inclusive trials, we can have these insights into unique health needs of different populations and groups, as well as treatment responses for diverse populations. We had done some work earlier on trying to look at attitudes and beliefs toward biobehavioral research participation. And so we had looked at a mixed methods approach where we had individuals in focus groups as well as completing surveys. And there were Black adolescent females in the US between the ages of 12 and 19. And interestingly, some of the things that came out from the surveys, nearly 9 in 10 had favorable attitudes toward research. And then we asked them about different types of samples that they would be willing to give. And then we had almost 80% saying that they would be likely or very likely to participate in a study if they were asked to give a urine sample, all the way down to blood via venipuncture being 41%, indicating that they would be very likely or likely to participate. So we see that there was like an openness or a willingness to participate. Some of the concerns that came up were around privacy and confidentiality. And this is going to be important when we're thinking about clinical trials as well, because we're typically collecting, right, these samples to assess the outcomes. So they were concerned as a young population of whether or not there would be disclosure to their parents or guardians, or if there was urine testing, was this to also be able to get drug testing data that would be shared with police? So those things came up. They also had this desire to receive an easy to follow enrollment guide, right? So an infographic, a one pager, something where they could clearly see from start to finish what they were going to be asked to do. And they wanted to have the study findings shared with them. Some of the facilitators that came out of the focus groups were that they believed research was about finding solutions. And one of the young people said, you can like help with the cure for something. So they had this altruistic sense that being able to be a part of a study would contribute to this greater good or generating new knowledge that might be able to make people healthier and even save lives. Some of the barriers that came up were that you wouldn't know where the information was going, or that research could make us a statistic about bad things. And I really want to put a pin in that last one. So when we're writing grants or we're publishing papers, we think about it from the perspective of describing the problem, right? But when you are the person that's being talked about, you're talked about like you're the problem. So when we say, well, 90% didn't do this, and 20% were not compliant, they didn't want to be a part of these studies if it was going to be said, that they were bad or they were wrong or they weren't doing what they were supposed to do. So now let's delve into some of the barriers that come up as we think about enrolling diverse populations into our trials. There's a laundry list, and you can see here I have the question mark because I'm sure that you have also identified some in the work that you're doing. And even now, you can feel free to put in the chat some of the barriers that you've encountered in the work that you're doing. But one could be language and cultural barriers, right? And so I know we sometimes have that inclination to say, X speaking only, whether that's English, Spanish, Mandarin, right? Depending on where we are, it's a lot easier to engage with people who speak the language that we speak because there's added work and expense to translate, and interpret and hire staff who can speak different languages. But if we want to be inclusive, if we want to generate science and have these new advancements that are going to apply to multiple populations, then we need to attend to that in our study design. So those are some barriers. Lack of trust in not only healthcare, but we get the double whammy of lack of trust in healthcare and the research community, right? So there are horrible things that have happened to people over time. So when we show up with a consent form or a flyer, or they're at a visit with a healthcare provider who's saying, hey, we have this treatment that might be able to help you with your condition, there may be some initial reservation or hesitation because of things that have happened. The risk versus personal benefit. If you are asking someone to do something that will cause them pain, make them not feel well, and if there's no direct benefit to them, or if they don't have this increased chance of hope for survival or something else, that can make it hard to participate. Limited access to healthcare and clinical trial information. This gets into those structural inequities, right? Where we say, well, who is even being invited to participate? And we have data that shows historically certain populations weren't asked to be in trials because people believed that they would be non-compliant, that they would not adhere to the study protocol. And so that was creating inequities in enrollment. Fear of the trial, or the procedures that would happen as part of the trial. Is there going to be pain, discomfort? Will they get worse with what's going on with them? And then this last one, not for us, by us, where there's this sense of you're asking me to participate in something, but then everyone who's talking to me about it doesn't look like me, doesn't sound like me, doesn't have a similar lived experience to what I've gone through. And so that could make someone less inclined to join. We can break through those barriers, though, and so we're going to highlight some strategies to improve enrollment. And as we get into this, again, not an exhaustive list, but just wanted to put some thoughts out there as you're moving forward in your work. Increase representation in recruitment materials. So making sure shading of skin tone, texture of hair, whether or not there is a hijab, whether or not someone is on crutches or in a wheelchair, right? People want to see themselves when they're looking at these sort of processes. So you want to have that diversity in your materials. Implementing culturally congruent recruitment and retention strategies. Everything that I'm saying, one of the ways that you're going to be able to do this is to talk to the individuals that you are hoping to enroll. So having them coming together for a focused conversation, or, focus groups, interviews, if you have the capacity to do that, but they will be able to say to you, and I'm going to show you in a later slide what that can look like, but they'll let you know what they want to hear and what they would want to know to consider participating. Diversify research teams. And that's going to be including the key demographic for your trial on your study team. I'm emphasizing this here as PIs and co-Is, not just as consultants or advisory board members. There is a time and place for everything, but when you give someone investigative team membership, that is saying, I view you as an equal partner in this process, and you will also have part of the decision-making power, right? And so by diversifying the teams, that increases representation and people will see themselves. Collaborate with community organizations and leaders. They're already ingrained and entrenched in the environments that you're hoping to recruit from. So make sure that they have a seat at the table as you're engaging in this work. Advocate for policies that require diverse representation, right? Ensure that funders are saying, in order to receive this money, you need to have a population that mirrors your national demographic, or you need to have a population that reflects, the diversity and demographics of the people who are affected by this particular condition. So that's something that we want to emphasize. Provide language assistance and interpretation services, right? So that you are overcoming the language and the cultural barriers. Engage in community outreach and education programs in a mutually beneficial way, right? So you want to do your trial, but they may want to have a backpack drive. They may need to have a health fair to do screenings with people in their neighborhood. By being entrenched and ingrained in these communities, you're showing that you're not only trying to get something and take away, but you also have something to offer. Establish partnerships with these trusted institutions. So this could be community centers, places of worship, schools, right? The options are limited. Barbershops, there's unlimited options that you can take to do that, but then you're getting them right where they are because you're engaging with those people. Address financial and logistical barriers. Support diversity training and education for resources. This is not a one-time, I took this course and I have my stamp of approval now, but this really needs to be viewed as continuing education for all of us and something that we commit to in our day-to-day practice as researchers. And then sharing best practices. I thank the organizers for putting this together because now we are here to hear from and learn from one another about how we can address this really important issue. As I mentioned, we had done a project. We heard the voices of our participants from that study that I shared with you, where we were asking them about their attitudes toward biobehavioral research participation. And they were like, look, we just want to know the real deal. We want someone to keep it real with us so we know what research is, how it works, and I'll use the language that the young people were using. That's nasty. Why do they want pee? Why do they want spit? There was confusion around what we would even do with those samples and that data. And so we came up with an educational program, excuse me, to walk them through the process. And I think it was really helpful. I want to note this here. I am guest editing a topical collection on research for equity and justice for Discover Social Science and Health, excuse me. And so this topic or anything related to it, I encourage you to look that up and submit your submissions to the call for papers. That's going through March 21st. So you have some time to get your submissions together. And then I will leave you with a few concluding thoughts. In order to achieve diversity in our clinical trials, it is crucial, right, that we do this so that we can have equitable healthcare and improve our treatment outcomes. We will be able to do this work when we address the barriers, build trust, ensure that there is access and inclusion in the trials that we're running, and then promote diversity in research in multiple ways. And then lastly, I really see this as our collective responsibility to create this inclusive research environment, not just for clinical trials, but for all the work that we do, because we know then that that's going to lead to this more effective and personalized healthcare. Thank you so much for your time, and I look forward to answering your questions at the end.
Thank you so much, Dr. Rice, for that great intro on the need for diversity. And of course, you provided some great statistics on our rainbow nation. So in South Africa, they always call South Africa the rainbow nation, but I think we should also call the United States a rainbow nation with so many colors that are involved. And thanks too for sharing your findings on studies that are looking at the attitudes and knowledge of minority groups. Emphasize on the issues around lack of trust and also about writing bad things about us. And I also want to quote from you, not from us by us, something like that. Here you are talking about an engaged community. So to continue with our discussions, we're going to have Dr. Mullins to share with us.
Thank you very much to George Washington University and the Millikan Institute for inviting me to participate in a very important topic on diversity plans for improving enrollment in underrepresented racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials. I've been at University of Maryland, Baltimore, which is an academic medical center, for just about 30 years now. And I recall that 30 years ago, when I joined here in the School of Pharmacy, that we were having discussions about the way that healthcare providers discussed patients. And we heard Dr. Rice talk about how patients are, quote, non-compliant. And there was a discussion at the time in the context of healthcare that perhaps rather than labeling the patients, and in some cases appearing to blame patients for not being compliant with their prescribed regimens, that we should think about patients' preferences and how it is that the structure of how we deliver care and our actions might have an impact on whether or not patients take a therapy as recommended. And so here we sit 30 years later, and in many ways, I feel we do the same in research, that we talk about the fact that certain groups are not participating as if it's their fault. So I want to echo some of what Dr. Rice said about this idea of thinking about how we can motivate participation. And my solution, and the solution that we use in the patients program at University of Maryland, Baltimore, is this idea that we could co-develop clinical trials with patients, with community providers, and with others who influence patients' healthcare decisions, but also their willingness to enroll in a clinical trial. And that as we move in this direction of co-development, people will be motivated to participate. Much of what I'm talking about is within the National Institute of Health, and in particular, the Clinical and Translational Science Awards Consortium that talks about how we can improve community-engaged research by engaging patients and community members much more consistently and much more authentically in the way that we conduct research, and that part of that is developing that partnership. Part of it is creating a process by which researchers and community members can interact to generate and then disseminate knowledge that we can contribute to the discipline of science, and that through that we can then strengthen the well-being of communities. And if we then have these conversations with patients and communities across the diversity of individuals in the United States and across the world, that people and the communities that are able to participate will have the ability to participate. A couple of the goals of community engaged research is to build that trust that we know is necessary, but also to enlist new resources and allies who can help to leverage the community and their ability to participate and their willingness to participate if we redesign research from that patient, from that community lens. We oftentimes talk about this concept of what's called helicopter research here in Baltimore. And as our community engagement specialists say, that in Baltimore, if a helicopter is flying overhead late at night with a spotlight, it's usually not for good reasons. And that they're trying to take someone, they're trying to find someone. And oftentimes research feels the same way, that someone's helicoptering in to grab someone for a particular purpose like research. And in research, it then feels like people helicopter out and the researchers are nowhere to be found after a research study. So how do we stop that? How do we stop having people and patients feel like guinea pigs? And how do we address those historical events like Tuskegee and Henrietta Lacks? But also, how do we address some of the things that are happening today that maybe aren't getting the same headlines as what happened in Tuskegee or what happened with Miss Henrietta Lacks, but are preventing willing patients to participate in research? What we hear in our research, similar to Dr. Rice, is that many people, especially people from marginalized populations, which could include racial and ethnic minorities, but also could include people with different levels of ability. We oftentimes hear from our blind patients and our deaf patients that they too feel that they look different and therefore are not asked to participate. Oftentimes people feel invisible or devalued, and certainly we hear the term guinea pigs used quite often. And so how do we change that and have people understand that we value what they can contribute, but that we also value potential participants enough to explain what is research, how can you get involved, not just as a participant, but how can you get involved as a co-developer? What we also know is that many people feel that the word diversity is used as code word for a particular group of individuals, such as African Americans. And that for many people who come from those communities, it appears that you simply want me because I fit a box that you need to check for the funding agency, but you don't recognize the diversity within my community. You treat all of us as if we're the same. And so our true strength, our true diversity is oftentimes overlooked, and we're simply labeled because of a particular racial and ethnic category or particular characteristics, such as whether or not I can see or whether or not I can hear. And when we do that, we devalue communities, and that reduces their interest in participating in research. In fact, what we oftentimes hear is that from a patient or community member perspective, that they feel that the only importance that many researchers place on a patient is their ability to give something to a researcher, such as that blood specimen, or as Dr. Ray said, that spit. And we've got to change that. We oftentimes think of patients as merely being able to participate in research as a human subject. But to me, that's really the lowest level of engagement if we're talking about community engaged research. That this article from Laura Forsyth from 2015 and subsequent publications by Dr. Perfetto, a colleague of mine here at University of Maryland, Baltimore, talk about the fact that patients can really give us informal insights into how to design our research, that in fact they can become consultants, same as our professional colleagues can. And not just as a one-time focus group, but they could over time become advisory committee members who meet with us on a regular basis to make sure that we plan our research, we conduct our research, and we disseminate what we've learned in partnership. And as we continue to advance the levels of engagement and the ability of not just some of our co-investigators to reach that co-investigator status, but an actual patient or community member to be treated as a co-investigator who's helping us to design research so that it is meaningful to patients. Because what we know is that research is confusing for many patients. And if people don't understand something, they're likely to not want to participate. If people don't understand something, they're more likely to fear it. And some of the fear that people have about research is because they don't understand it. So how do we bring people in to help us develop the language of our research so that we can communicate better? What is this research study doing? What is the question that we're answering? Because if it's an important question to patients, then patients will be more likely to participate. So my main message is about enhancing the levels of engagement of how we work with patients. We will always have patients as study participants, but we could over time have other patients who are further along their survivorship journey, helping us as consultants, helping us as partners, and eventually to lead how it is that we design and conduct our research. Our approach at the Patients Program at University of Maryland, Baltimore is to use a 10-step framework for continuous patient engagement in research, in which patients with lived experiences help us to plan our research in the first 3 phases of what are we going to study, and of the things we can study, what are the most important questions to answer? And then how do we translate that question so that patients would understand it? How can we bring in patients with lived experience to help us while we're doing our research, while we're selecting the appropriate comparators and outcomes, while we're designing and explaining what our conceptual framework is for our research? Even things related to the analysis plan, patients can help us to think through based upon the intersection of how we're going to analyze data and how it's collected. There's meaningful input that patients can give to help us, even as we're conducting our study protocols. And then certainly as we're delivering what we've learned, we call it delivering solutions, because for many of the patients that we engage, we hear that when they have a health problem, they're not just looking for a research result, they're looking for a solution to their health problem. And so how do we review and interpret the results with patients to get it into language that other patients could understand and therefore act upon in consultation with their community-based providers? And so using this 10-step framework, we have 2 different groups of patients, those that will ultimately be participants in our study, but another group of patients who are on this journey with us as co-developers of our research to make research more meaningful so that other patients will choose to participate. The reason that we do that is that we believe if we frame the question so it's understood, then when science develops an answer, patients will understand what we've learned. It's all too often the case that when we have new ways to improve human health, it takes at least 10 years for that to get into routine clinical practice. And we believe it's because people don't understand the results of research, and so they don't know how to act upon it. But if we could frame questions so that patients and their community healthcare providers understood the research question, they would then understand the answer to that. And we could translate for cultural appropriateness on how do we, in a particular context, in a particular culture, use the information that we've learned from clinical trials and other research to improve the health of all Americans and all people around the world. Finally, I would say that if we're going to buy into this concept of engaging patients continuously, that we need to be there. And all too often, patients who have participated feel that they've never heard what we learned. They feel that all too often researchers leave their community as soon as the research study is completed. And how is it that we can be there for patients who volunteer their time to participate in our studies? How can we come back to their communities to share what we've learned? How can we come back to their communities simply to educate people on the importance of taking care of your health and not always do it in the context of research? And how can we help to connect them to resources so that when we have ways to improve human health, individuals are able to connect to resources that can help them to live happy and healthy lives? Thanks for the opportunity to share today.
Thank you very much, Dr. Mullins, for emphasizing on community engaged research as a very, very important solution when it comes to improving diversity in our studies. You emphasize on co-developing studies with the underrepresented groups involving them. And you also emphasize on being there for these underrepresented communities. I like your emphasis also on issues, the labels that we often hear about guinea pigs, about checking boxes, right? Have you just checked this box? Have you included this group? And then you check that particular box. So you might check it now, but in future you might have issues again in involving that particular group in your future studies. So thank you very much for sharing with us some of those very, very practical strategies. And to continue with our deliberations, we're going to hear from Dr. Eccles. Over to you.
All right, can you all hear me okay? All right,
Yes.
perfect. So first of all, thank you so much for inviting me. This is such a treat. I am learning how to kind of talk about things now that have become a little bit more of my new platform, but still all sort of in the name of health equity, and more primarily and focused on the lived patient experience. And, I'm going to take you through a couple of stories. I think that we all know one of the best ways to interact and sort of share and relate in this field or in this manner is to, sort of relate to stories or empathize with history that someone has shared. So hopefully you will get something out of this. This is one of my favorite quotes. So essentially, life is a succession of lessons, which must be lived to be understood. So, when you are, little and you have all these aspirations of what you want to do, there are no thoughts about, barriers and facilitators and social determinants of health. None of this stuff means anything to us. And so, how do we get to from that to what we're doing now, and how do we make it make sense? I think that there really aren't any major objectives. Like I said, there's storytelling. I want us to, excuse me, I'm going to give myself permission to be open and allow for this moment to sort of invite the vulnerability in this space, because some of these things are heavy, and I think that the only way we're going to bridge that new gap in terms of communication and aligning our patient values with participant or patient's values, we must actually basically know what they're feeling and how they're experiencing situations. And so I say all of that to say, here we go. So I'm from this really rural town in North Carolina, Ivanhoe, North Carolina. Now, last time I checked, we'll do some census stuff in a little bit, but maybe 400 people. I don't think we've ever seen a stoplight ever in the town. The only like structural like building we have other than residential properties is the one brick post office. So that's where I came from, North Carolina. And it was, really interesting because all of these things that we're labeled upon in terms of rural versus urban and all of these things that we associate with health, again, as a living person, living breathing person in that environment, you don't relate these things to sort of adversities. Now, why does that matter? Well, looking at sort of population-based metrics, one of my criticisms has always been, this is a population-based metric. It does not tell you what's going on with the individual patient that's living in that area. And so you have to, sort of consider that as well. And then you have to also consider all the other metrics that come along with sort of confounding and the things that we are not able to measure. So to say that, this is the Christmas of 1989. Now, I'm not afraid. I just turned 47. So I was 12 whenever this happened. And this was the winter of one of the worst snowstorms in North Carolina. Living in North Carolina, you hardly ever would see snow on Christmas. That was like never a possibility. It's usually in January, February, or April or March, but you never saw it. And then all of a sudden, this particular Christmas, we had like a foot of snow, which is for us, that's a lot. We were used to hurricanes more than anything else. But we had just had a great Christmas. I think I had gotten like everything I wanted. Like I said, I was 12, didn't know anything. And one night, the evening of the 27th, all of a sudden we heard like these like, footsteps running to the door. And it was my cousin. And she said, they always came to my mom. The daughter of actually baby of 11 children from my grandmother. So they all stayed in that area and they all were, very close, but they always would come to her. And so they said, my dad is on the floor and he's not breathing. So she runs down and, we don't know what to do. So we're running down too, because we have no idea. And when we try to get into the door, we can't even get into the door because basically when he came in from work, he started having symptoms of a heart attack, turned around and flat out died, sudden cardiac death. We, by the time, obviously, so we had actually gotten to him, or he was agonal breathing, perhaps, but, no one knew what to do. And then too, I was 12. Again, this is in the country. Yes, this is what you see. Now, guess what? This is snow. We don't deal with snow. We call 911. What happens? They can't get to us. So we sit as a family for 12 hours around his body, waiting for EMS to come and pick up him and his remains, and so that we can move forward and start organizing. And I tell you this story because it's so long ago, but as I'm telling it, it still is so fresh in my mind in terms of the medical sort of trauma that you can experience by just being a bystander. And so I want people to understand that when we're talking about trying to engage people in the clinical trials, that comes with a whole lot of background and homework that you know nothing of. And so as you're trying to sort of walk with them into a place of clinical investigation, it's always very important to just kind of make sure you check in on the lived experience or history of trials or sort of experiences before, because I guarantee you that if it was a bad or negative experience, it's definitely still in their mind. So why do I bring this up? Well, population wise, my uncle was 53. He was a bigger guy. He smoked, but he was set up for heart disease. And as we see here, he had actually the very first symptom or sign that most people see, or at least 50% of people see with heart disease. First sign symptom, dead, sudden cardiac death. And so that's very important for us to know. I tell that, I sort of, go move that fact everywhere, because people don't understand. Half of the people don't even make it to the hospital. This is rural America. I think, there are some very key distinctions between access and care. For instance, the closest hospital to Ivanhoe was 45 minutes away. We actually, on a good day, you could speed down the road, like, at night, and maybe get there in 30 minutes, but that was about it. And that was your best chance, and instead of waiting for EMS. Again, these are learned behaviors, and these are learned cultures that over time people, do to survive. But why is this so important in terms of the rural area and that sort of, region we call southeastern United States? Well, probably because that area is one of the areas, or sort of the most common area for heart disease and death in our country. That's also the area that they tend to call the stroke belt. But guess what? These little blobs, they kind of look pretty much the same, or at least they're overlapping at least. But then guess what? Well, hey, people with the poorest social determinants of health, as determined by, I think this was the ADI. Don't quote me on that. It was the ADI or the SVI. But the highest, quintiles of adversity, we're saying, yeah, in this area as well. So you're having these overlapping things here. But guess what? Well, where are all of the, or most of the concentration of African Americans in the United States? Again, right here in this area that we sit. And so whenever we're discussing things about, again, engagement history, trial history and all those things, it's very important to know, number one, for educational purposes, for the participants, sort of where they sit in terms of mortality rates. And that's an engaging factor to know as you sort of build out sort of programs and trials that can be very helpful for people. So this is sort of the statistics here. Nothing major. We were in poverty. I can tell you, there's my little blob right there. The ADI, I think that, yeah, this is the area deprivation index. So we had a decile of 9. So 10 is the highest and the worst. So that's where we were. But also to boot, my dad died at 29. And my mom was widowed, and so she actually raised us off of $10,000 a year. Now, how in the heck that happened, I have no idea. Like, if you asked me to do that today, I would be lost. My mom was a genius, is a genius. But that's what it is. That's what the area says you are in terms of population metrics, and so that's what everybody approaches whenever they start talking about engagement. But sometimes it goes a lot further than that. So the question now becomes, how can you understand your population level social determinants of health, such that they enhance the lived experience of people who have conditions like CVD? And, I would challenge you to ask patients, or inform patients about the things that are important to you, because I guarantee you, if you ask the patient, hey, what are your social determinants of health measures there? They're going to probably look at you like you have 3 heads, because we're talking different languages. And so we have to understand how we can align our communication. Everybody knows what these are. This is a little history here. Born in North Carolina, trained at Duke. Guess what? We saw a lot of these, but guess what? I saw a lot more of these at age 10, 11, 12 here. Now, what is this? So these are tobacco fields. So they look all pretty and glistening. But they have this stench that is unbelievable, and it's everywhere in the morning. I can still smell it right now, and in the morning they're quite wet and gloopy and gloppy and muddy and glazy, and you have to crop tobacco. So I had to do that if I wanted like brand name clothes. My mom said, no, we're not doing that. You know, if you want something outside of the budget, you're gonna have to work for it. So that's kind of where we go from there. But this is the process. We had to do this every single summer. And guess when I stopped? Well, actually, they had to do it every single summer. I tried it one summer, and then I saw this little fellow, and yeah, that was it for me. They're everywhere on the tobacco leaves. They have stingers. They're called hornworms. But yeah, so that was enough. But what has happened in our community is the population that used to this work that, where either the generations have phased out or gotten older, now other populations of people have come in to do the work right there in North Carolina, the same stuff, age 12. I mean, this is ongoing. And so, these all, again, lived experiences. It's work. You have to do what you have to do. But I think that part of the lived experience is understanding, number one, that we will get a lot of information from population-based metrics. We understand that, right? Because we as a people, I think one of the guest speakers said, when you say 90%, even though you might not be talking about, them collect, as a person, they feel it, directly as, and I think that's exactly right. But we've got to get past that, because if it were not for the lived experience and the description of the lived experience, we wouldn't have the symptoms and signs and symptoms that we have today. And so we have to start thinking about this in a new way, where we are able to engage patients, not only to engage patients to, complete trials that we want them to complete or to help us come up with ideas, but we want to engage patients because we want them to understand why it is important to take care of their health. And, I could go on and on about that, but I won't. I will say this: there was the last sort of, quick pace story. Fast forward to 2023. I'm at home having fun with my, mom at home and my aunt, and we come home from church. She passes out. My aunt passes out. This is 2023. I call 911. Oh my gosh, where is it? Oh well, hey, this is Pender County. You've reached. This is Pender County. You're in Sampson County. Oh, wait, what? I'm calling 911. What's going on? Well, guess what? In rural North Carolina and many parts of the United States, cell phones sometimes will not be on landline sort of units. And so basically they ping to the nearest tower. We tend to sit on the border. Actually, we sit on the border of two counties. So we always ping the Pender. So instead of 911 getting the call, transferring, taking, dispatching everybody, no, we get to the point where we get to dispatcher. She starts the process, but then realizes we're not in the county. My aunt's still laying there. I'm actively trying to, resuscitate her. Now, granted, she was syncopal, non-cardiac, thank God. As I was, going crazy over the phone and trying to take care of her, because my mom couldn't even dial 911 because she got so frazzled. Again, lived experience. This means something, people. And so whenever I am, in this situation, I lost it. And I just said, why is it that nobody understands the need to get here? And my aunt laying there on the, ground, as we're trying to get her back sort of, stronger, she just said, because they just don't care about us. And that has still rung in my head every time I think about this story, because there's so much in this lived experience. It took them an hour to get there. If she had had cardiac arrest, even me being a cardiologist, Duke trained cardiologist, I wouldn't have had anything for her. And that would have gone down in my history as a lived experience, as a failed lived experience in my mind. But these are the consequences that we deal with whenever we're not bringing up these stories and talking about these things like we should. The last slide was basically areas and opportunities for the lived experience to exist in medicine and clinical research. But we have done many things in this area, including community health work and engagement in the rural cardiovascular community in New Mexico, and a number of things sort of guided by this framework that we've developed for the health force task force. So I will stop there. Other than to say, the lived experience means even more to me now because unfortunately I suffered January of last year, suffered a medical complication. It was in the ICU for 4 months on dialysis, ventilated, had like 8 abdominal surgeries. I got out like, 4 or 5 months later, lost 100 pounds, had to learn how to walk, talk, eat, everything. All of this happened in 2023. And we are now here 9 months after that year. And I've returned to almost full capacity and know that someone is blessing me much higher than me. And I'm just thankful to be here today. So thank you all for having me.
Thank you very much, Dr. Eccles, for bringing your personal experience into all this. And of course, emphasizing that as researchers, we actually need to bring ourselves into this. You emphasize on the importance of lived experiences of communities and emphasizing on the fact that we actually need to understand those lived experiences so that we can clearly engage those communities and come up with strategies that can ensure that they can actually be included in our studies. So thank you to our 3 panelists for those brilliant talks. We have received so many questions from our participants, and I think we just have time to focus on a few of those. And one of those questions has to do with international trials. So there is someone here who is emphasizing, who is asking the question, how can the underrepresentation of racial and ethnic populations in clinical trials be ethically addressed without contributing to ethics dumping in low and middle income countries in the global south? So here there is emphasis on the collaborations where we're involving researchers in the US and researchers in other countries. So how can we ensure that as we are addressing the issue of inclusion of underrepresented minorities, we are not involved in ethics dumping? So let's hear from any of you of our panelists.
I can go first. Well, I think the first thing is to, before you even start thinking that it begins the very first, word of your design of your study. So based on your clinical question and where you want to go in terms of your scope, these are plans. This is why the FDA is, impressing upon people to understand, your diversity plan and your recruitment plan so that you can actually look at challenges and barriers and sort of think ahead. And give an ideal of what you would do with your preconceived goals or targets. And now that's up for discussion, but I think it takes much more planning than people think.
Thank you. Any other thoughts from our other panelists? Melissa, you are also free to contribute.
I wanted to thank all of our speakers today so much for your informative information and for the information on your slides. It's been very helpful to us. You can see that we have so many questions. Unfortunately, we won't have time to get all of them, but if you'd be welcome to contact from the participants in the future, please let us know, because I know many people have ideas and want to follow up because they're working on their the same issues and want suggestions on how to do things better.
Thank you. And let me pose a practical question here from one of our participants. How do sites prepare to enroll and retain underrepresented populations in clinical trials? Let's hear from Dr. Rice.
And you said, how do sites propose to
prepare to enroll and retain underrepresented populations in clinical trials?
Yes. So I think Dr. Mullins proposed a great, I believe it was a 10-step strategy that people can use, because if you don't have a plan in the beginning, diversity is going to be an afterthought. So in addition to the inclusion and enrollment reports that we're required to do when we're writing grants, actually having strategies for each of the cells, right? The individuals that you're talking about. So if you are proposing that you are going to enroll, 50 individuals who self-identify as female and Latina, then you want to make sure that you have a plan for where you're going to go to recruit that demographic, the individuals that you can partner with to ensure that they can be reached, right? So it's having that set out from the beginning, but then actually engaging with people in the spaces to make it happen.
Thank you so much. And there is also a very practical question here. Someone wants to know the role of the site clinical research coordinator in enrollment and retention efforts, and particularly in ensuring that underrepresented populations are included in our studies. Let's hear from Dr. Mullins.
Yes, I actually just threw an article in the chat where we go through our 10-step framework and how it applies to clinical site coordinators, because as we know, that oftentimes coordinators are trained in what the study is about, but they're not very well trained in how to recruit diverse participants. In the ideal situation in which they are, we all know that many of our clinical site coordinators go on for advanced degrees. They may go get an MD, a PhD, an advanced nursing or pharmacy degree. And so at the turnover time, people come in and then really aren't oftentimes acclimated to the recruitment strategies, even if they were there at the beginning. And so I think that there needs to be a continuous education. And one of the strategies that we used in our trial was, in the same way that for a multi-site trial, oftentimes investigators get together and they talk about whether a patient meets the inclusion and exclusion criteria. And it's for clinical sites to understand whether someone qualifies or not. What we did with our study out of Penn is we brought a clinical site coordinator in to talk about a patient who was on the fence as to whether or not they were going to participate. And it didn't matter whether in the end the patient chose to participate or not. We used that for the clinical site coordinators to talk about how could you continue the conversation without being coercive with this patient to help them decide whether or not to participate, right? So how do we empower our clinical site coordinators to be able to have better conversations with patients who maybe aren't sure whether they want to participate or not?
Thank you so much. So now I'm going to ask each of you to give 30 seconds in parting shots, starting off with Dr. Eccles.
No, I think that I've enjoyed this. This has been really great. Again, I think that you should, as much as possible, try to connect, spend some time with the patients and build rapport, and sort of build relationships over time. And I promise you, you will always have a wealth of people who are engaged and motivated and want to work with you.
Thank you, Dr. Rice.
Yes, my heart is encouraged by the number of people who are on, and so continuing to encourage you to engage in the work. And I think at this stage, we really need the policy piece, right? So being in communication with sponsors to say, these are the things that we need to fund. Someone had asked, the resources aren't there. So they're saying that they want diversity, but then we're not giving resources for people to travel to agencies, right? Or that have the time to build those relationships. So we can speak to the funding sources to say, these are the things when you put out your next call for proposals, or as you are structuring your budget, right? Like advocating to say, can you make sure that there are line items that would also cover, the extensive engagement that's required to get to the populations we're saying that we want to reach. So we want to continue doing the research, but also going to that next level to advocate for the policy changes and the funding changes.
Thank you so much. And Dr. Mullins?
Yes, I think many of the industries that are regulated by the U.S. Food and Drug Administration have really developed quite nice diversity action plans. I think where we oftentimes fail to follow through on that is what is our contingency plan if our action plan doesn't meet its goals, right? And so how do we not just have a plan, but how do we do continuous quality improvement on the way in which we do outreach, so that if we're not meeting our targets, that we don't just keep doing the same thing if it's not working, but we pivot midstream to get back to the goals that we sought originally.
Thank you so much. And so let me just take a few more seconds to talk about some of the upcoming events. So on the 1st of October, we are going to have a meeting. This one is an internal meeting within GW, where we are focusing on monkeypox. And of course, we've got one of our internal experts who is going to come and talk to us about this growing challenge. And then, of course, on the 16th of October, we're going to have another webinar, which is focusing on ethical challenges in public health practice. So let me take this opportunity now to thank you all for participating in this webinar, and a special thanks to our three panelists for taking time to join us here. And of course, for additional resources, you are more than welcome to visit our webpage. We've got recordings of all the previous webinars that are there, so you can actually take time to view them. And then for our students within the George Washington University, our students may submit their professional enhancement activity forms to the email address that is listed there. And of course, we are going to sign them and return them so that you can receive your PE hours by being part of this event. Melissa, a final word from you?
No, thank you. Thanks, Paul. And thanks again to our participants. And we really learned a lot today. And I think our audiences, you can tell from how many people are here still after the hour plus that this is a big issue. So thanks again for helping today.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Goodbye, everyone.